don't quote it. Oh, okay.
I'm recording because I'm going to make some comments in a few minutes.
Okay.
It's only for you.
Okay, so just mostly some structural things were very helpful, but I felt myself getting too thick into the weeds. So what I thought, I really have to lock down, what am I doing?
Yeah.
So I decided to push that aside and just focus on the first chapter, because I really feel like if I could get the first chapter and the outline for the lit review, then the rest of it's going to fall into place. I'll see where there are holes. I'll see what I don't need. So that's why I just stopped and I refocused, like, okay, I just, after reading chapter 1, I'm actually nervous to see, does it make sense?
Yeah, you're on the right track. So today is more, how do we fine tune it even a little bit more? And
absolutely. Okay.
And I really want you to hear this about all doctoral work. About 50% of the dissertation, whether it's a PhD or a DMin, is really the organization. And can the reader follow what you're trying to accomplish? And then 50% of it is, and did you deliver on what you claimed?
Right.
But if people, what happens, I think a lot of times, this happened to me in my own doctoral work, we do get so enamored with the range of materials that we sort of lose our path and trying, particularly for an outside reader, to figure out how you get from A to B to C to D before it's all said and done.
Mm-hmm.
PhDs are a little bit better at that than DMins because they're straight line argumentation and you have to win the argument at the end of the day. DMins, a lot of times, it built on the old sort of social science model, where basically the first half of the DMin was, here's all the things I needed to erect and create, if you will, an experiment, social science experiment. And then then if that experiment works, it proves my point. And this is why a lot of EDDs, and you'll run into, if you ever read, and I wouldn't necessarily do this unless you like a good night's sleep. But if you ever read 5 or 6 EDDs back to back, you'll start running into terminology like confounded. And that word just means that they didn't take into consideration all the elements when they constructed their social science experiment. And therefore they couldn't get the results they hoped for, but they hoped that the process of just trying to create the experiment was good enough, okay? But ultimately, whether that experiment works or not is pretty much whether everything goes. What we do in our DMin program is we don't make you do that. We don't make you set up a pre-test, post-test. You don't run 2 or 3 cycles of people through your curriculum to show efficacy. All you're trying to do is build enough of an argument at the front end to say, and this is why I think this curriculum makes a difference. And that's a little bit more of an amalgam between a PhD that really wants people to buy into your argument before you show them the curriculum, because you can't show the end result. And that's where the organization, it becomes so important. So yes, I've always kind of looking at your dissertation, has always been sort of 2 or 3 big rocks. One of them is who's the audience and what different, and where will this make a difference? The second one has been, and so, why these practices in this context? And those 2 things go together. And then the third one is, and what has Wesley got to do with this? Because you have this kind of parachuted piece in your review of literature on Wesley. And so it's been kind of going, how do I make sure I connect the dots for all 3 of those? I think I've already alluded to this. I think up front, you kind of bit off more than you could chew, and taking on the entire Church of the Nazarenes' inability to focus on Christian practices. And I think if you could have done a dissertation just trying to prove that fact and still not necessarily have gotten there. So I think this one is a lot smarter in the way in which you're kind of saying, there's one way of winning an argument is saying there's a deficit and this corrects it. There's another way of saying, well, this is okay, but this actually improves it. So I'm not necessarily saying everything's been bad or there's been a major loss, but this actually might make it better. There's an innovation here that gives us a new way of thinking that doesn't necessarily have to critique everything else. So you don't have to prove that your criticism's absolutely correct. But you're really kind of saying, but can you buy my argument that this innovation might be helpful? And that's a little bit better way to go. So when I read through, and normally I would have read and typed at the same time, but I was away from my computer, so I had to do it old school.
Okay.
And that's why I'm recording, so that if I do these things verbally, you can reference it that way, because don't have everything typed up inside the text. Couple things I like, just to be upfront, is I like that you've kind of narrowed this down to how does this fit within sort of the ordinary, customary, traditional approach to Christian education, and instead of taking on everything that the Church Nazarene does, and that in some ways this is sort of correcting for a heavy emphasis on the cognitive side of Christian education. And I do think, I mean, there are people that I'm sure you've already read, like James K. Smith's critique of thinking things versus aligning the heart. You mentioned Sorensen early in here, that kind of come alongside that. And I think that part is helpful. I actually think this is one place, either in the introduction or in the first chapter, where you could actually go back to that curriculum review that you did, which I didn't think would ever sell when it comes to showing that these practices never occur.
Okay.
But I think you could say, here's a case in point where if you just look at the curriculum over a year, how much of an emphasis is on content and knowledge, as opposed to spiritual formation practices or other kinds of things. And so now you could use that. Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay, you froze there for a minute.
Okay. So now you could use the curriculum, but it's more as a case in point to show the heavy reliance on sort of cognitive approaches inside the curriculum.
Okay.
Do you think it will do that? Now you got to, but if you think, I think most people would say, yes, in a traditional Sunday school small groups format, the emphasis on knowledge, cognitive knowledge, tends to take priority over other components. And I think you could find lots of people that, I mean, you could probably spend time just getting 2 or 3 articles that already make that argument and stand there alongside, and you could show that piece. I think the thing that you might nuance is that in some ways, and I think this might be really important in light of what you've written here. Does that emphasis not only tend to focus on the cognitive, but since that emphasis is at an age level, does that also make it very difficult for intergenerational engagement around content? So if in a way, you'd be asking something that the entire intergenerational crowd keeps asking, is there something implicit in the way we have structured our Sunday school classes that just makes it difficult for that to be a medium for intergenerational learning? Yeah, because you're always dealing primarily with the student's capacity to cognitively comprehend what that content's about. So could there be other places where intergenerational learning could happen that's better than those age level condition kinds of contexts and settings?
And if I remember correctly, Garland did speak about that quite a bit in her book.
She does, and she raises that question. What I'm about to suggest is just one of those things that in a way, when you're trying to get people to buy into your criticism, it's how big a tribe can you lean into that sort of become sort of like mess with me, you're messing with all these people at the same time. And a good example is the whole Intergenerate. I don't know if I ever sent you that organization, but there's a whole organization Holly Allen is involved with. And if you heard Holly speak at any of the leadership conferences, the last two that SDMI had, she is sort of the one way to think about it is she is the Christian church version of Diana Garland. And she has an organization called Intergenerate. And I think you would find within just one or two books, sort of what you're kind of constructing is, and only people of a certain age get this. To your Tony Orlando, you're constructing Dawn, who just all sit back there and go, yes, this has been a problem. This has been a problem. It's like, well, and it's almost rhetorically going, well, obviously, if there's 7 or 8 theorists out there who have said this has been a problem when it comes that we we've been too age level focused and not focused enough on intergenerational relationships, then you don't have to spend time doing a lot of empirical work. You're allowing them to come alongside and just resource what you're saying. Okay.
Okay.
And to me, that's important. In the way you kind of open this, I mean, you start with a kind of general struggle within Christian education in this cognitive battle, and then you go to a Wesleyan approach and how within the denomination it needs to be Wesleyan. But then you get to family adventure camp, and you say something actually, and I'm on page 4, at the bottom of page 4, that I find fascinating. And away you go. To this day, we recognize the need to explain the attributes of an intergenerational camp. Okay. And I have to wait to page 4 really to get into intergenerational language. Now you can't add it on page 1 because you use Garland, but that is mainly a critique of just focusing on one form of knowledge. And what I'm going to suggest is early or in the introduction, maybe one of the things you need to say is to nuance this a little bit more, is that spiritual formation practices really work better for intergenerational models of Christian education. And camp, hear this language, camp provides an incubator for experimentation and innovation to see how that can really work, that Sunday school classrooms and small groups don't necessarily provide.
Okay.
Okay. And when at least I've just articulated it, but when I hear that kind of an argument, you're not saying that Sunday school is not doing its job. You're just saying Sunday school can't do certain things. You're not saying that spiritual formation can't happen. You're just saying that if you want it to be intergenerational, or more importantly, that spiritual formation can be really helpful when you think about family practice, intergenerational engagement. And then finally, what you're saying is, and guess what? This can really make a difference to a particular model of family camps, that family camps haven't stopped to really realize that they have this capacity to do really well. Okay. Now you've introduced a different, so the problem is less a problem of lack, and it's the possibility of innovation. So what can this DMin do that, it acknowledges some of the weaknesses, the problems that we have, the obstacles that we have, but really offers something that's a different way of thinking about doing spiritual formation in an intergenerational setting? And could family camp actually be a very unique setting to design curriculum that gives you a chance to experiment and explore and look at what differences that can make? Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
And the front half of your dissertation, in some ways, is really kind of answering that question on 4 more than any of the others. I mean, you still have to deal with these bigger pieces. So I'm not saying get rid of what you've done. It's just saying, how do you put that intergenerational play early enough that becomes part and parcel what you're trying to accomplish.
Okay.
And then that allows you in some ways to keep that intergenerational language in mind as you go along. So here's a case in point. At page 2, okay, if do you have your draft in front of you? Okay.
I do.
Okay, even church camps that are intentionally conducted in a different environment are often driven by the goal of gaining knowledge about God as the primary method of knowing God. Whereas knowledge is important, it's not only a method, it's not the only method for spiritual growth, particularly within intergenerational settings.
Okay.
Okay. The imbalance may fail to equip people and practices that shape the person's spiritual life, and you put in the language outside of the church setting, or you could put within intergenerational relationships and engagement. And what you're doing is you're keeping the focus much more tightly into what you're trying to accomplish. It may work better outside a church setting, but more importantly, if you want to be intergenerational, it tends to work better in this kind of a context instead of that. Now,
Okay, I see. It carries that theme through the point, yeah.
And you keep the big rocks out there. So in some ways, it's spiritual formation, it's intergenerational engagement. I mean, that's why you got an intergenerational family camp, and it's Wesleyan. I'm gonna come to that as well. But for now, I'm just trying to say, how do you keep the reader focused where you want to be, and you avoid statements that force them then to demand something that you really don't intend to try to provide through your dissertation. Okay. And I'll give you another case in point.
Okay.
Just real quick, and I have to skip down to the top of page 4. Okay. And you go, this study is designed to help church camp leaders identify, learn, and lead in Christian education methods, okay, that include spiritual practices, which can be carried into a participant's everyday life, promoting a lifestyle of spiritual growth. Now, are you really going to prove that? Or are you really saying that can then be implemented within an intergenerational context so that it promotes the lifestyle of spiritual growth? When you say carried into a participant's everyday life, then I'm already, I mean, I hope you hear, this was one of those little safety flares. We make those kinds of statements and then it gets us in trouble. So at that point, I'm going, so you're going to tell me at the end that your curriculum on silence, solitude, and Visio Divina can be applied in everyday life, in every context. And that's what your curriculum is going to do. And you're going, no, this curriculum is really about bringing intergenerational people around and utilizing those to engage and grow in the spiritual life. And so it's just learning to keep the main thing, the main thing.
Okay.
And you sort of bounce through that piece. And I do think if you do that, and very intentionally, then you're well down the road of kind of thinking through how to rework the dissertation when it comes to kind of understanding how all this material starts to talk to each other. But I would literally almost put on top above your keyboard somewhere intergenerational spiritual practices, Wesley. And that way you always kind of keep saying, what's the organic relationship between the three of these? And then knowing that you need to keep that out in front of whoever the reader is, so that by the time they get to the curriculum, they're going, well, obviously, this is why the curriculum is designed this way. Obviously, is why it's designed this way. And so that becomes the goal of the flow of the argumentation and the organization of all that material. So case in point, if you really want to take on sort of, I mean, it's not going to be a major fight. You're not going to say that age level learning is evil, but that because we tended to focus on age level learning around cognition. And so all of our curriculum is basically said, what's the capacity of the student's capabilities to know? And so we always are trying to deliver the content at the level that the child, the youth can understand. Then you could probably make a reasonable case out of both Christian education literature, out of Intergenerate and others who just talk about both the strengths and the limits of a schooling paradigm and a schooling model based on cognition. And you're not going to say it's evil. It's just that this is why there's such a struggle. And this is why camps can actually offer something else instead. So you're just showing it as a comparison, the limits of one versus the strengths of the other. And if you think you need to convince people of that, I mean, you thinking about your readership, that if nothing else, you just have to say Sunday school and Bible studies, anything organized at an age level, really begin with a sort of assuming a certain limit to the capacity of the participant in light of that. Just so that they don't keep trying to then turn camps into Sunday schools. Or more importantly, how do I say, even that children's camps and youth camps don't always think carefully about intergenerational, because they're kind of stuck in that paradigm as well. It just keeps people to go, why is this particular camp so different? And that's why you want to make that argument. So we're trying, you're almost literally saying, folks, I'm trying to say intergenerational can work, but camps might be the place it can work the best, even from that standpoint. Okay.
Okay.
And I would almost go back through here, and I would not change any sections to start with. I mean, the family adventure camp being the third section in here means that you at least started with a broader consideration and kind of narrowed that down before you talked about, and here's your personal context. And I kind of like that. There are some people who start with right where they're struggling and what they're dealing with, and then move. But then you need to understand from an outside reader's standpoint, your camp may have this problem, but unless you convince me it's a problem from my setting, I'm not going to read it. So I like how you started with this imbalanced methodology, but I would say keep it within the language of sort of how the limited the cognition work actually makes good sense to me if you compare it kind of strategically with why then we do age level classification the way we've done it in the church.
Right. Okay.
And then you can say, then you can move to go, and so this is a different way of doing intergenerational learning through spiritual practices, and why I think that would work. And then you may pull a couple more books that will support you from within intergenerational thought, and you may be able to get them on EBSCO, so you don't have to buy a bunch of stuff. But I think that would get your argument tight enough that it would not only speak to the Christian camping group, but and I'm serious about this, Tiffany, it could be the kind of thing you could do a presentation at an Intergenerate conference, at an intergenerational gathering, family ministry or child spirituality in the intergenerational setting, saying, this is why these camps might be really helpful down the road. Okay. And you've moved away from this idea that the Church Nazarene just doesn't know how to do certain spiritual practices to saying this is a very strategic offering that can make a real difference in the future if we think about how curriculum can be designed in the camping environment that really does draw upon certain practices that invite the whole family to engage in them in a very particular way. Okay. The only piece that you make sort of a general comment in here that I could see where you might still need to pull some information together. Let me see if I can find it. Hang on. Oh, me. I'll find it in a second. there's a place in here where you basically say, oh, here it is, under Wesleyan. I don't want to get to the Wesleyan yet, but there was a place in here where you make the claim that most of the Nazarene camps still tend to fall into this cognitive and activity divide.
Mm-hmm.
And you use Sorensen kind of focusing on conversion as a part of that. But I would say that is one place. I mean, I don't mind your sort of your early critique of Nazarene Sunday school, but really trying to find the sense. Oh, there was one sentence in here that was just a flare at the time I saw it, but there's a place where you kind of allude to,
Is it on page 2?
it could be. Is it the one where it says these, they also influenced many church camps, how many church camps were organized? Yeah, I guess the simplest way I'd say it is, if there would be a place, maybe in the introduction or in the first chapter, when you're kind of in, and this is where your review of literature, if you divide the review of literature up into sort of, so where is the problem? I mean, do I need to expand on how this problem occurred? And do I have one section kind of elaborating on the problem a little bit more, just kind of making sure everybody understands the problem as I see it. Again, that could be where you would include your review of the curriculum and just that the curriculum seems to continue to affirm a cognitive approach built on the student's ability, cognitive abilities. So it's tend to be focused at the student's cognitive abilities, not anything else or more than anything else. Yes, we do tend to see this in curriculum, children's camp curriculum that are done by Nazarene camps. That might, or done by camps in general. And this goes back to, and you could research this a couple of different ways. One is, I don't know, are you a member of the Christian Camping Association, or is your camp a member of that group? Okay.
No.
Okay. It might be contacting them and saying, are there 2 or 3 curriculum that you guys have used that you could send me? Or are there guidelines for how to organize a camp, Christian camp? What you're looking for is something that could back up the claim that I think your experience says when we do these summer children's camps, particularly district children's camps, there's still activity and cognition, but you're going to have to convince someone of that.
Okay.
And so if there's a way, even if if inside the Nazarene Children's Ministry pipeline, if there are 2 or 3 curriculum that's tended to be passed around over the past 3 or 4 years, or like VBSs,
Right.
and you could say, send those to me. But what you're trying to do is do a modest evaluation just to say, look, folks, this is an organic component, but in light of these 2 or 3 selections, or in light of these guidelines from the Christian Camping Association, that divide between cognition and activity tends to occur with an emphasis on conversion. Yeah, that's true. We tend to see that. And you're not have to do an exhaustive study because you're not trying to take on the whole of the Church of Nazarenes discipleship, but you're just trying to say, if you hang out long enough, you're going to see this as being a kind of problem. And I don't know who you would want to contact to make that happen. So whether it's a Margaret Tyler and people inside Ignite, for instance, Kyle Tyler and the Ignite crowd, or if it's going on the Facebook pages, the NCLN, and saying, hey folks, I'm just looking for curriculums that have been used at summer camps. Are there some that are shared, not just homegrown, but shared? And can you guys, provide those to me? Or send an email to the Christian Camping Association saying, I'm doing research and wonder if you have, 1 or 2 sort of recommended curriculums for people who are starting camp ministry.
Okay.
Point people to. It could be a book that they use. but it just gives you a place to see, here's an example of the problem.
Mhm.
Okay. And
All right.
that would be about the only other thing I'd be concerned about in
Okay.
building the problem. I don't think it's not a massive problem. You're trying to say that this is all evil. It's just saying, yeah, that tends to happen when it's left, particularly, and I would even say when it's left at children's ministry or youth ministry alone. The reason, I hope you hear what I'm about to say, the reason I want to say that is because the very people I'm going to turn you loose on youth front has not approached camps that way for 20 years. And so they would be going, what do you mean? We don't do it that way.
Right.
And so you need to have at least examples, and you might say, well, God bless you. That's one reason why you're not Nazarene, but you need to have some way to say, but if you leave the children's pastors to kind of home grow their district children's camp, or if you leave it to the youth pastors to figure out what is going on, you tend to fall into these patterns. Now, I haven't read Sorensen's book. He may have some of that there. If he did actual analysis of different types of camps, but I can't help but think there's probably either in the Journal of Christian Education or in some other places, there's been some research on the sort of curriculum and camp ministry that you might be able to find people to kind of come alongside and support you from that standpoint.
Okay.
Okay. Small piece as you get into the review of literature, but it's just almost starting out the review by saying the first thing we're going to do is just, reaffirm why this problem exists and how it tends to perpetuate itself. And now we're going to look at the response of that, the importance of Christian practices, and particularly in light of a Wesleyan perspective. Obviously, since my Sunday school answer is, I don't know what it is, but it must be the means of grace. The fact you moved that up in that literature was probably helpful, at least for this reader. I'm not pulling up your big document, but in your big document, you got sort of three different components that you allude to in this introduction, I think fairly well. One is, well, Wesley has a particular view of salvation. Wesley has a particular view of Christian practices through the means of grace. The third one, the weird one, is, and Wesley tended to rely on a certain set of resources out of the quadrilateral, which and again, this is where making people know why you're using things the way you're using them is really important. So I'll be upfront with you. The first time I started reading the quadrilateral stuff, I was like, why in the Sam Hill is that here now? Okay. And 95% of the people I know in Wesley studies would say exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I'm about to give you a way of using that material. So this is where I get my bonus dollars in today. Okay.
All right. I'm ready.
All right. So if the big question is spiritual formation within an intergenerational setting, so let's use that as the kind of large component of which Christian camps provide a really unique way of doing it. Okay. Then the question becomes, from a Wesleyan theological standpoint, from within the Ordo Salutis, Wesley's vision of salvation, why is intergenerational helpful? Well, one suggestion would be that Wesley's vision of salvation is very comprehensive and can speak to every part of intergenerational gathering, from prevenient grace with children right up through holiness of heart and life and entire sanctification with adults. And in their intergenerational engagement, this holistic vision of salvation speaks to the whole of this intergenerational community or context. Okay. Then two, well, the means of grace is just the language of spiritual formation within the Wesleyan tradition. It is a sure and profound trust that these practices really do in some ways invite us into the very grace of God. And I want you to hear already this idea of a comprehensive salvation for an intergenerational gathering is a pretty new piece. I mean, I haven't run into that often. So I think you could use it that way and people be going, oh, we haven't thought about it that way. I mean, we keep thinking about sort of basically the Ordo Salutis is almost like a developmental stages from prevenient to justifying to sanctifying to glorification, or you're just dead. Either way you want to think about it that way. But what you're saying is no, this just means that grace is at work at every point within intergenerational engagements. And you can even talk about how big the vision is and everything else, but it's serving the intergenerational component. Okay. Then the means of grace serves the basically the spiritual formation component, the Christian practices, however you want to use that language. Now here comes the quadrilateral. So what you could say is, and I don't think you quite said it this way, but I think you were headed this direction. So I'm hoping this makes sense to you too.
Okay.
So stay with my argument. So if our tendency is to focus too much on cognition, thinking things, well, we've always used these 4 sources within the quadrilateral to inform theological reflection. Could they actually help us organize our Wesleyan Christian practice? And so can they be a resource, not merely for our thinking, but for our practice together? And could that be actually a good way to assure that, particularly within an intergenerational setting, that we're getting the full range of the kinds of resources that are possible, to assure that we're getting that kind of ability to engage the very resources that Wesley himself did, not just for thinking, but actually literally for practicing our faith in the midst of these kinds of practices. And can we organize this material in such a way that it helps us recognize those same resources fit the practice as much as it does the thinking? If you make that a front end to how you're then using the quadrilateral, then people go, oh, now I know why you're doing what you're doing.
Okay.
Not just what you did, but what you've basically said is, maybe this isn't the traditional way to use a quadrilateral, but maybe this is an innovative way that we can try, and it may actually give us a whole new way of thinking about the quadrilateral that's slightly different. Particularly, again, I always say it this way, particularly within an intergenerational spiritual formation setting, that helps us to appreciate the gifts of each one of those categories to something other than a theologian sitting down trying to write a theology paper, and straining to try to make sure all 4 of those components show up in their paper. Okay, if you do that, you are pretty much done with describing the Wesley component, and that last piece is really a one way to say it is, it leans into then the construction of the curriculum from that standpoint. And so it leads people, as they're reading the front end of your dissertation, right, to anticipate how the curriculum is going to be constructed as well. All right. Now, the one thing we haven't talked about today that didn't quite show up as, I don't think, as heavily in here as it does in your overall paper, in your overall dissertation, but that's okay, is these 3 approaches of solitude, silence, and visio divina. And if you remember my criticism, I mean, even according to your survey, was that even a lot of people have identified silence as a part of spiritual formation practice. So it's not like these have been absent. So,
well, I do have one thing to add to that, and I need to, let me ask you about that, because I was surprised by that. So when I followed through and asked people more about it, about their answers and that kind of conversation afterward, almost every single person came back and said, well, you have to be quiet in church. You have to be quiet when you pray. It was a distinction of a different definition of what the practice of silence was. So I think if I expand on that, then that won't throw people. What do you think?
Well, you might get a better survey response, but I would say most people, when they hear the word silence, they would tend to relate it with quiet time with God. And I don't, and honestly, that even in Sunday school, sometimes for behavioral control, we've said, well, you're going to have some quiet time with Jesus right now. So they probably don't understand how silence functions,
Right.
but that they're very much aware that silence is a part of the Christian life. So let's just see whether this argument would work just as well. So stay with me.
Okay.
You were arguing that these are important because of their lack within the broader general church.
Mm-hmm.
But could you also make the argument that these are three things that actually work very well within intergenerational settings?
Mm-hmm.
Because, in some ways, unless solitude means individual solitude, but if it means, being able to be alone in the midst of a group of people would be one of the things to think about. I mean, and there's been literature on relationships about sort of how to be alone together, but
Right. Yeah.
but in some ways, these just happen to be very good practices that an intergenerational family camp can implement, and everybody from children to older adults can participate in,
Mm-hmm.
and they grow together as a result of that participation. So instead of arguing out of a posture of lack in the church, you're arguing out of a posture of the assets of each of these practices to provide for a strong, intergenerationally minded spiritual practice.
Okay.
And then you could even talk about the context of family camps, particularly the kind of camp you have, which does allow, if it's not over-programmed with multiple activities, if it creates space for this kind of thing, if it creates opportunities for Visio Divina that are based on the God's good creation and the beauty of the world around, all you're doing is arguing out of the strengths of those practices instead of out of some perceived lack in the world at large. The reason I say that is because Visio Divina, which we probably don't think as much about, but there is a very robust literature on Visio Divina, really around architecture, art, even the beauty of creation. So it's there. But what you're saying is in this setting, particularly, you can't avoid it. I mean, so if you're at the camp and with the mountains and the wilderness and the beauty of the earth, there are just sort of natural opportunities for Visio Divina, and you don't have to have a certain cognitive ability to appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's a young kid at the beginning of daybreak in the morning with the sun coming out over the mountains, or if it's a senior adult and it's beside a brook, both hearing, listening, and appreciating the beauty of what's going on in those moments, or if it is introducing artwork, even alongside that.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that it doesn't matter what your age level is and your cognitive capacity. This is something you can participate in for the sake of your own spiritual journey. Probably between the three, then the silence, there'd be some people say, well, what about young kids, particularly with impulse control, right? I said, well, because there are other developmental issues other than just cognition. And that's where you could, that'd be one of those places where, you could, there's an objection there, but I can qualify this and say what even makes it more powerful is if they're practicing silence together as children and adults, because the adults can serve as a model and a true guide in what silence looks like. And so you're capitalizing on those intergenerational relationships as a result of it. So you could still stay with those three practices, but it's not so much I'm going to correct what's missing in the Church of the Nazarene as it is these really can make a difference within this kind of incubator of spiritual formation, intergenerational spiritual formation. These three things really can be the kinds of things that point out the strengths of this kind of a setting. And if it feels like a sales pitch at that point for the camp, who cares? But what you're really trying to say is, and if you adopt this curriculum in your camp, this can have the same kind of possible impact there. It becomes transportable because of what it's accomplishing or can accomplish versus what it's trying to correct, which to me is, we always get in problems. This is, it's kind of like having that sometimes 13-year-olds in the church or 56-year-olds, could be either, going, yeah, but, and they're just there to correct any assertion you're making. So you don't make something that just invites people to argue against you. You make it in such a way that invites them to think with you about what the future looks like. So for today, I hope you hear, I like where you've gone. I mean, the introduction doesn't need a lot. It's more tweaking. And it's always about, okay, so what I'm arguing, what you're presenting for your DMin dissertation out of your experience is basically a model of intergenerational spiritual formation that helps to augment, offset a sort of unhealthy overemphasis on cognitive ability because of age level classifications. I mean, it's not wrong, but if you're going to teach the cognition, you have to tailor it to the level of the person's thinking, which tends to exclude others who aren't right at that level, either above or below. So it's just offering a different way of doing that. And you're doing it in such a way that it respects both the breadth of Wesley's vision of salvation, the definition of the practice that spiritual formation practices, and it organizes it in a way that would be true to Wesley, albeit in a very novel way. So that as these three practices that you have selected sort of weave themselves out in the curriculum, it provides a very powerful model for intergenerational spiritual formation that draws from the camping context in such a way it makes a difference. If you can keep that in the midst of writing different sections, and I really want you to hear, this happens to me, it happens to everybody, when you're writing the section, you're trying to gain control of that section of material, right? So you do that deep dive, and then you come back out and it's like, you want to jump right into the next deep dive. As you write, make sure the reader stays with you through each of those segments. You know, how do they see your overview of Wesley's vision of salvation really speaks to the fullness of intergenerational ministry. So when you open with that and you close with that in the midst of all that description of holiness stuff in the middle, you just make sure they recognize this is why I'm dealing with this, folks. When you get into the means of grace, why are you doing that as a particular adoption of spiritual formation practices? You know, why that instead of Brett Webb Mitchell's Christly gestures? I mean, it's Wesleyan, and so it's a natural way for people within our context to understand those. It may not be the only way, but it fits our theology, since this is the way was. Then why the quadrilateral? And that might be, well, you know, the interesting thing is the quadrilateral start out to really sort of guide theological reflection, parentheses, cognition. But actually, I think it might actually work also in thinking about how we structure a curriculum to introduce practices, just to make sure we're drawing from the resources. Now, the thing I haven't said is then you got to make sure you prove that. I mean, but I'm assuming you can do that. I'm here to help you today. Just think about the large flow of the argument. Right. And so that by the time they come out of that going, okay, so I buy it to some degree. I buy it. That intergenerational spiritual formation can actually work better in a camp kind of setting compared to a classroom kind of setting, just because it doesn't, you know, you're not having to work against the implications of a classroom or Bible study model already anchored in age level division. I get that this is actually a place where, you know, intergenerationally we can actually hang on to Wesley's vision of salvation because it speaks to all aspects of those, whether you're a child or youth or adult. It's always at work comprehensively. It's holistic in its organization. And that, yeah, these practices are indeed means of grace. And okay, I'm willing to follow you through this kind of curriculum structure. And then and yes, these three practices seem to be good examples. They might not be exhaustive, but very good examples of the way to do this within a family camp setting. Let's see what that looks like in the design of the curriculum. And you've got me sold to stay through and see how the curriculum is organized and how it flows from the end. Okay?
Yep.
Is that
Oh,
doable?
it's good.
Is that doable for?
It is doable. I can do that.
Okay. I really, Tiffany, the biggest thing is, and I hope you hear this. I think you've got lots of good work that you've done. It's just getting it organized. And so I'd go back to this
Mhm.
and actually coming out of the family adventure camp, just and through that section, just at some point, you can decide then whether you want to weave it in everywhere or not. The very thing I've described, you just say, and the rest of the dissertation will do this. And this is how I'm going to take you through this. And you start with, I'm going to elaborate on the problem to some degree, showing why this is an impasse. I'm going to describe what spiritual formation practices do and why they're helpful within intergenerational thinking. And that's where, if you haven't looked at John Roberto's work, I mentioned him in the last edition. He oversees a website called Lifelong Faith.
Mhm.
And if you Google his name, you'll find it. And he wrote one of the better intergenerational curriculums that really looked at Christian practices, not spiritual formation, but Christian practices. It's the difference between the practicing our faith crowd and the spiritual formation crowd. But he's already shown that some ways families do better when they're active together instead of cognitive. And so that's why he would be helpful from that standpoint.
Okay.
But then I can walk you through the three Wesley elements, and then I can say, and this is why I selected these three particular practices to organize the curriculum for now. Then I think you have people ready to read the rest of the dissertation. And I always say this, then go back to your introduction, and every time you open up a new chapter or you move from one section to the next, you just remind them of what you said in the dissertation. You don't say back in the introduction I said, but you just remind them why this fits. And the opening and the closing always keeps the main things the main thing. I don't know what it is, but it must be intergenerational. I don't know what it is, but it must be spiritual formation. I don't know what it is, but it's all about a holistic Wesleyan salvation for intergenerational. It just keeps people connected so that when you get to the curriculum design, which I think you have, I mean, I think you tried to argue it as a methodology. I don't think you'll have to do a ton more there, but I'm going to let somebody else figure that out. The one piece I will say about the back end of the dissertation as it is, that's just a fair caution. Standards for publication, what that really means is that you could hand that material to someone and they could start from scratch and use it in their context.
Yeah.
And I've not read that part of your work that closely, but that may be the one place where working with the second reader, be it Jamie Roach or somebody just does curriculum. I mean, if we can't get you front to do it, if we can find someone who is really adept at writing curriculum, if you were to even think about, if you were to offer this to the Christian Camping Association, then what would they have to have so that if it's a camp, in the middle of Florida, they can still use it where they're setting. And that's what's going on.
Yeah, the issue there, I originally was going to have an artifact, and then I was told I couldn't. So I was trying to incorporate it as examples, and that's why it just doesn't. It's not good.
Well,
so
but you can go
now
back.
that I'm back to where I can do an artifact, I can get it the way it's supposed to be.
Right, because you can write it just with what you'd have to provide the camp leaders at your camp to make it work. So I'm not too worried, but you probably will have to do that. That's the one piece I won't be guiding you in. It'll probably be Jamie or somebody else.
I'm actually just looking forward to getting to that point.
I get it. Well, I think there's not a whole lot of more research to do. Probably the three things that kind of for triangulation. Number one is find a couple more friends in the intergenerational side to back up what you're saying. And I'd start with Holly Miller's book, Intergenerate, mainly because it's multi-authored and there may be a couple of chapters instead of just one author that kind of backs that up. She also did a book earlier on intergenerational ministry. She co-authored with somebody else. And so
And it's Holly, what was her last name again?
Miller,
Miller.
yeah, she's at David Lipscomb in Nashville.
Okay, yeah.
And so she would be, I mean, she's an intro into that tribe of people.
Mhm.
And all you're doing there is just getting people to back you up from that.
Right,
stuff.
right.
The next piece is, if you're going to critique current curriculums, can you find a couple, and I wouldn't say an exhaustive review of curriculum, but a couple of cases in point. This is where illustrations do work, where age level curriculum doesn't always get you there. This could be. And that you do that kind of work. And I really think those are the two big areas that you really have to focus on, bringing some outside support in to back up what you're already doing. It's just nuancing the argument as you go along. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
I've been hammering at you. You got any questions for me?
No, I need to just get on it. I'm trying to carve out, I work best when I have like a couple days here and a couple days there. So I've been carving out over the next several weeks of when I can maybe just go to the campground and just dive in and do that kind of thing. So as I get chunks worked, would you like to see those? And
you could. This one was helpful as you keep building out the introduction. It's not only just an introduction, it's going to be your writing map.
Right.
I'm very busy, and I rather like to see big blocks.
Okay.
Because if you've noticed, I'm more interested. I'm not here to argue whether your understanding of Wesley's soteriology is exactly the same as mine. If it's in the ballpark, I'm not going to fight that. Right. Same thing with the means of grace. You don't have to quote me 15 times to make me happy. But if you drop from Hal Knight and other places, I know that even some of the coursework probably included some readings there. I'm not going to fight the inside battle that much unless you're just completely off. Okay. My bigger thing is, I think you got the data. It's really organizing it so that it's compelling. And then let's get done with me and get into whoever's going to work with that curriculum so we can get you
right. Right. So do you think maybe next week you may have a lead for me?
Yes, I promise. Tuesday will be Mike King. If you want on your calendar, send me an email Tuesday morning saying, just a reminder, you're going to talk to Mike King about getting a second reader. So that stays in my face.
Okay.
And then I can be working on that for you. And if that doesn't seem to be working well, I mean, we might find somebody else who's done that kind of more camp ministry or spiritual formation curriculum, and not get somebody at the pub house, for instance, who writes age level curriculum to evaluate it.
Right.
That wouldn't make any sense. But finding somebody, I think I could find some people that might even get somebody like a Holly Allen, for instance, who might be willing to be the second reader. Now that we've added this intergenerational component, she might be motivated. And I actually have a couple of friends in the intergenerational side who owe me. So if we get to it, I can pull a card before it's over with. Call in a debt.
Okay. And as far as deadlines go, I want to make sure I'm tracking with when I need to get this pulled together. My understanding is I have to have something done by the end of November.
For me, yes. And
okay.
I think the final iteration has to be in January. But but now that we've gotten this far along, you better have something pretty well developed in November. And part of this is just my time, because whatever I get, you need to allow for me 2 to 3 weeks to schedule it in, to read it, to send it back for any revisions. But then the penultimate draft needs to be in January, and we get your second reader involved as well. So I don't pay as close attention to those deadlines until they're right up on me. And Tiffany, I don't mean this in any disparaging way, but by bringing you in, I've got other students I'm trying to stay on top of at the same time. So getting it in early works better for me to sandwich it in between my other commitments as well. But, and I think I've seen chunks. Now it's really the final form and the flow.
Okay.
Is where I'm
So
really-
when I'm in a discussion with a second reader, what I need, they're going to ask me, well, when will you get something to me and when will you need it back? So I'm trying to block those times out so I can.
Yeah, I would say whatever you get to me, one is you're going to have to convince them of the rationale right alongside me. So don't assume they don't read the front half. They may not read it closely.
Right.
And then I would say you definitely have to have the curriculum in place by January for them.
Okay.
So,
When do and when will they need to have their?
if memory serves me, it all has to be done in February. You
Okay.
schedule your defense in March.
Okay.
But don't hold me. This is when I'm not the director of the program. You call Levi and say, give me my target dates. Because truthfully, I'll look at Levi in November and say, now, when are those dates that we have to hit in the spring? And this is what supervisors do. I mean, we don't keep the calendar. We follow the calendar as director tells us to follow it.
Right.
So I would double check any of those dates with Levi. All I would say is whatever the deadlines are, do not drop something in on me like 3 days before a deadline or a week. Think about what you need to back up to give me space to work with it from that.
Okay.
I want
Because the remnants of our cohort, we've been meeting together.
okay.
It's been huge. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And we were all having this discussion. They're like, when do we have to have things?
This is the terrible thing around doctoral work. I mean, because we live on a semester deadline system, right? Everybody knows when the semester is in, but dissertations don't work the same way.
No.
And frankly, faculty, because if you knew how many, COVID created a lot of this,
Oh, yeah.
but there've been so many extensions and so many deferrals that I really meant to get it. But truthfully, and I have done this at doctoral level, PhD level, where highly motivated, very sharp people can't hit a deadline. And so you're always in that. And so finally, faculty get jaded. Yeah, this is the deadline. That just means you're going to be contacting me to ask about an extension. I mean, it's a terrible mindset, but it happened at that level because our work doesn't quite always fit calendar boxes.
That's very true, because we're in ministry too. So
that's true. And you're probably wondering, how does this fit with Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter as much as anything else? And I'm going, how does this fit with 3 conferences and paper presentations I've got to give as well. So I really want you to hear the next thing. Mainly because I was pretty hard on you the first time we had a conversation together.
that's okay. I'm welcome to it. I need to get through this. So
I know I want you to get done. I want you to hear this though. I want you to get done. That's my major goal. But I think now with this kind of an argument, this is the kind of thing that when you get done, you can do a presentation at an Intergenerate conference. You can speak at maybe an LC 2023. There are places where this kind of an approach, you're going to contribute to a bigger audience over time, because people will say, yeah, this gives us a different way of thinking. And so one of my goals has always been to say that the work that comes out is something that contributes, not just gets you the DMin, the doctorate, but can actually contribute to a broader audience. And I think now, particularly with this introduction, I think you've got a shot at doing that. So,
excellent.
So keep that in front. It's because always think about, I'm writing to an audience that includes Dr. Blevins, but will ultimately be bigger than Dr. Blevins. I actually believe that's true. Okay. All right.
Very good. Thank you for your time.
Blessings to you. And I'll post this on YouTube and send you the link. And I promise to keep it unlisted. So from that standpoint, okay?
All right. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.